In this video, I want to talk about the Arctic. We hear a lot of talk about military competition in the Arctic, military buildups in the Arctic, but unfortunately, it's not quite clear what the Arctic means, and it's not necessarily a helpful term. So the term the Arctic is being thrown around a lot these days. We hear a lot of talks about military competition, military buildups, militarization of the Arctic. Unfortunately, it's not quite clear what the Arctic means. And when we use the term the Arctic, or sometimes what's called the High North, what happens is that sometimes things are connected that don't actually have anything to do with each other. So in this video, I want to talk about how the Arctic is actually not a coherent region, but how in fact we have different Arctics, and we should maybe understand the Arctic more in terms of its separate parts than as a sort of united whole. So I have Google Earth. What we see is somewhere around the middle we have, of course, the North Pole, and for whatever reason, the ocean here is blue, but in fact it's mostly ice. So in reality, this would be white. The first thing to be aware of is that from a military perspective, there are actually very different conditions in the different parts of the Arctic. So if we look at this, I mean, it's all cold. The Arctic, it's all freezing cold, but it's not equally cold everywhere. So if we have this picture here, then we could say on the right side we actually have a kind of a warmer Arctic, and then we have sort of the western part of the Arctic over here, and it's just cold. So climate-wise, we actually have very different conditions in what you can call the sort of eastern part of the Arctic and the western part of the Arctic, with the eastern part being a lot warmer and more accommodating for military operations. What we often talk about is the fact that missiles fired between Russia and the United States being over here, would pass over the Arctic. So you can say in the space domain, these different parts of the Arctic are definitely connected. But in other terms, they're actually not very well connected, and they don't necessarily have much to do with each other. It's very, very different dynamics playing out in different parts of this. And I count at least 5 Arctic regions or subregions, or how you want to put it. And I think I'm going to start with Europe, actually. So here we have the European Arctic. We have Norway here, Sweden here, Finland here, and Russia here, and here is Svalbard. And what's characteristic about the European Arctic is that it is the most militarized of all the Arctic regions. We have militarization in all domains going on here, including the land domain. So there's a very, very heavy ground component to militarization in the Arctic in Europe. And that's, of course, because we have the Gulf Stream warming Europe, etc. It's cold, but it's actually possible to operate in the European Arctic year-round. Ground forces can even operate pretty efficiently in the winter if with the right training and the right equipment in the European Arctic. Also characteristic of the European Arctic is that we have NATO bordering Russia. So here in the very high north of Norway, we have the ground border actually between Norway and Russia, meaning that NATO and Russia have a ground border with each other. We also have countries like Sweden and Finland. They have maritime borders to the Baltic Sea, but they don't have maritime borders to the Arctic. And this means that Sweden and Finland necessarily view the Arctic as a much more ground-focused thing than many of the other Arctic powers that tend to view it as a maritime issue. The existence of Sweden and Finland therefore also connects the European Arctic to the Baltic region and further down into Central Europe. We also in the European theater have presence of US Marines in Norway. And finally, what we have in the Arctic region is we have the Barents Sea over here, where we have Russia's Atlantic fleet, which is based up here around the Kola Peninsula. And in the case of a war, they would want to get around Norway and further down into the Atlantic to conduct their operations, try to sort of interrupt the sea lines of communication for the United States. And this means that we have in the European Arctic also kind of choke point up here north of Norway. So that's the European Arctic. It's a heavily militarized area in all domains. Then we have the Russian Arctic. I think it's meaningful to view the Russian Arctic as separate from the European Arctic. I did mention the Russian Northern Fleet when I talked about the European Arctic, but in general, I think it makes sense to view the Russian Arctic as its own thing, because there are just very, very different dynamics going on here. The first thing to know about the Russian Arctic is that this is incidentally just where Russia happens to be, right? So just the fact that a large part of Russia is in the Arctic means that there is a lot of Russian activity in this area. So that's definitely something to keep in mind when we talk about the Russian Arctic. It's not all about Russia wanting to militarize or build up their forces in the Arctic necessarily. It's just a part of Russia. Climate change is influencing the region heavily. So the Northern Sea Route is opened. We see Russia investing heavily in both military but also civilian infrastructure projects in the Russian part of the Arctic, especially in this area here, the Yamal Peninsula. There is a lot of work going on to extract natural resources. And of course, when you extract resources in this region, you will want to transport these resources out of the region as well. So we see a lot of infrastructure projects being built to facilitate that this oil and gas being extracted from the Yamal Peninsula is being transported out into the world. As the Northern Sea Route is opening up, we see Russia trying to sort of exert control over this sea line. And in the West, this is often interpreted as a way for Russia to do something nefarious, to sort of break international law about the free movement, free navigation at sea. I won't go too much into the discussion here, but I think it's just important to note that Russia's arguments are not necessarily bad, and we shouldn't disregard them as just bogus. Russia actually does have some valid points, and I think this needs to be tried in court before we can say really who's right and who's wrong on this point. And in fact, the Russian points of view are largely shared by Canada, which has basically the same point of view about the Northwest Passage. Russia is also building up military infrastructure in their Arctic region. Sometimes it can be a little confusing as to exactly what threat they are viewing. But the fact is that Russia does see a threat, and they do see the need to build what could be interpreted as defensive measures in this region. So we are seeing a lot of projects going on in the Russian Arctic, both civilian and military, and that is increasing Russia's capabilities in the Arctic. But again, I think it's important to just remember that this is where Russia is, and that it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the rest of the Arctic, that they're building up the infrastructure in their part of the Arctic. Then we have what I like to call the North American Arctic, and I don't include Greenland in this. So this is basically Alaska, and it's Canada. And what's characteristic about this area is that it is extremely cold. So it's really difficult for ground forces to operate in this region. And Russia and the United States are actually pretty close to each other over here between Alaska and Chukotka. But we don't really have large ground formations on either side of this of the Bering Strait. So instead, what we have in the North American Arctic is basically an Air Force theater. So we have the American fighters in Alaska, and we have Russian military jets in Siberia, and they will interact regularly. But we don't have a large ground component here. And that's just because it's so freezing cold that it's more or less impossible to operate. So the climate provides a kind of protection here that means that large ground formations are not really in the picture in this area. I did not include Greenland in the North American Arctic. And that's because I think actually Greenland is a kind of its own region. And we can call this the Greenlandic Danish Arctic. So Greenland is different in a number of ways. It is the only region in the Arctic where we don't see heavy militarization going on. And in fact, we still have debates in both Greenland and Denmark about whether it's possible to keep the Arctic as an exceptional low tension area. The Greenlandic Arctic is also special in the way that Denmark is a small country that can't afford really to militarize this area. So the fact that this is the military responsibility of Denmark ensures that not a lot is going on actually in Greenland. What we do have that is important to the United States is we have the Thule Air Base over here, but basically that's also everything there is in Greenland that is important. It is just so cold, it is almost impossible to operate on the ground. And it is very well protected just by the sheer distance across Greenland here. But generally speaking, there is a very, very low degree of militarization going on in Greenland. And this means that we actually have here Greenland and Europe kind of close to each other with very, very different security dynamics. We have the heavily militarized European theater over here, and we have Greenland over here, where there's still talk about the Arctic as a low tension area. And then we have the final Arctic region, which I like to call the non-Arctic Arctic, but which basically is the Atlantic Ocean. So we could also call it the Atlantic Arctic. But it's just important because it has its own dynamic. And very often we see that politicians, military leaders tend to also call the Atlantic for the high north or the Arctic. So things get connected in that sense. Even though a lot of what's going on in this maritime domain is actually below the Arctic Circle. So it's basically the area here where in the case of a war, the United States and Canada would need to transport forces into Europe, and we have here the Russians, primarily submarines, would try to come down this way, and we have the GIUK gap here between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, where there would be lots of submarine operations, anti-submarine operations going on to sort of try to build a barrier here. Most of this theater is actually below the Arctic Circle, down here. But it has ties into the Arctic, of course, because that is where the Russian submarines would be coming from, and a part of the GIUK gap is also in the Arctic. So I think when we talk about the Arctic, it's important that we are aware that basically there are different parts of the Arctic with very different logics, and they are not necessarily connected to each other. We have the European theater, very heavily militarized. We have the Russian Arctic, which is mostly just a Russian thing, where Russia has kind of their own civilian military projects going on. We have the North American Arctic, where it's mostly an Air Force kind of thing. We have the Greenlandic Arctic, where they still haven't really noticed militarization in the Arctic at all. And then we have the non-Arctic Arctic, or the Atlantic Ocean, which is kind of a different thing, but still is often referred to as the Arctic or NATO in the high north or things like that. And essentially these different Arctics are not very well connected to each other, but very often we talk about it as if these things are connected. And that means that we can make mistakes because we interpret things the wrong way. So we see Russia doing something in their part of the Arctic, and we think this must have something to do with Greenland or with Alaska. But in reality, these different parts of the Arctic, the dynamics there are much more influenced by what happens below the Arctic Circle. Things like great power competition, events happening in Europe, the Middle East, we have spillover effects into the Arctic. We can have spillover effects the other way. So things happening in the European Arctic can have spillover effects into the Baltic, Central Europe, further down. So we have these kinds of effects a lot more than we actually do have between the different parts of the Arctic. And I think it's important that we stop throwing around this word, the Arctic, militarization in the Arctic, things like that, because it's misleading, it's confusing. So that was all for this time. We need to be smarter about the Arctic. Thanks for watching. See you next time.